And joining us now is Marci Shore, who's a professor of history at Yale University, who teaches the intellectual history of 20th and 21st century Central and Eastern Europe. She is the author of The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. And her forthcoming book is Eyeglasses Floating in Space, Central European Encounters That Came About While Searching for Truth. Welcome to Background Briefing, Marci Shore.
Thank you so much for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you are among the 6 global voices on Putin's invasion of Ukraine at CNN. And what you've said is actually very, very powerful and quite moving. And that is that this is no longer felt like a situation where a man, Putin, is playing a high-stakes chess game. Now it felt like a scene from Macbeth. My intuition is that an aging man facing his own death has decided to destroy the whole world. Ukraine is very possibly fighting for us all. So that is a very powerful image, and it's apparently backed up to some extent. There may even be dissent within the highest ranks of Russian military and intelligence. So is it possible that Putin has gone off the deep end?
Of course, it's very possible. I should say I have no privileged epistemological access. My comments were based on the fact that I listened quite carefully to his Crimea speech and other things he was saying, as unpleasant as they were back in 2014. And I listened to him quite carefully on Monday a week ago, now 10 days ago. I'm not a native Russian speaker. I'm sure native Russian speakers would pick up still more. But even to me, it was quite clear that this was no longer the same person. Not that he was ever a nice person. He was shrewd, he was cold, he was cynical, he was calculating. But there was a sense in 2014 that really you were dealing with the grandmaster, who knew how to play the game better than anybody else. And I had the distinct feeling listening to him talk about, Russian history, Ukrainian history, well, you want to see decommunization, I'll show you decommunization. His Russian was no longer so good. He didn't look well, and he sounded deranged. He sounded less sharp, less clever, less shrewd. And my intuition, this is only intuition, again, it can't be proven, was that we were now out of the master chess game analogy, and we were now in the Shakespearean drama analogy, where this was a man facing his own mortality who had an impulse to destroy the world. I think he's absolutely capable of that. I should also add that as a historian, one thing you see a lot is that lunatics play major historical roles all the time. I mean, one should never discount the historical importance of lunatics. I think people tend to think, if somebody's in a position of power, he must in some way be sane. No, there's no guarantee of that at all. In fact, it is just as much the rule for lunatics to play major historical roles as it is the exception.
Well, Fiona Hill, who was on the National Security Council in the Trump administration and was featured in the impeachment, particularly giving evidence about what happened with that call that Trump made to Zelensky, in which he was essentially blackmailing this young leader who's now under siege and under constant death threats from the Russians. It's worth noting that Trump was holding back these Javelin missiles as a bargaining chip in order to get Zelensky to give him dirt on Joe Biden. That's the level of interest that Trump had in geopolitics. And think about how important these Javelin missiles are to the current situation vis-a-vis this David versus Goliath battle that's going on in Ukraine.
I thought Fiona Hill did a very good job during that impeachment hearing. We could talk about that for a long time. That was another lunatic, playing a major historical role, unfortunately. I think what Fiona Hill understands very well is that Putin is capable of anything.
Well, in fact, that was a preface to my real question, which was that Fiona just did an interview with Politico, in which she said that Putin is perfectly capable of using a nuclear weapon. And that is something that we have to consider, surely, if you have this sort of caged animal syndrome where it's just not working out for him. And that seems to be the case. I mean, I hope it's the case. Otherwise, if he succeeds, then, we have to consider what kind of country Ukraine will become.
I can't even really bear the thought of contemplating that he could succeed. I am somehow desperately hopeful that in Russia itself, the Russians will figure out a way to get rid of him. There are clearly cracks, and the exchange that he had with his chief intelligence officer, Narishkin, a week or so ago, when he was asking him whether he supported the sovereignty of these republics, and Narishkin was saying, well, I will when, and he's like, hey, speak clearly. You do or you will. This could actually be a grammar lesson in perfective versus imperfective verbs in Russian, подержу или подерживаю. But what was significant about it was not the content or the subject, but the fact that there was actually a public crack, in Putin's inner circle. I think people must know that he's losing his mind. I mean, the question is anybody going to do something about it?
And again, I'm speaking with Marci Shore, who's a professor of history at Yale University, who teaches the intellectual history of 20th and 21st century Central and Eastern Europe. She is the author of The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. And her forthcoming book is Eyeglasses Floating in Space, Central European Encounters that Came About While Searching for Truth. Well, in that same surreal National Security Council meeting in the Great Hall in the Kremlin, where the National Security Council were sitting in a semicircle way across this big hall, and you have the Tsar sitting up on his throne barking at them like they're errant schoolboys, the guy that everybody thought was incredibly hawkish, and every reason to believe he is, Patrushev, the former FSB chief, National Security Advisor, he even suggested, quaking with fear, I might add, that maybe we should check with the Americans before we do this. And he got shouted down. So the thing that I've often, in fact, I actually had a conversation with, of all people, back in 2016, with Jill Stein, who was running as the Green candidate. And I tried to tell her that how dangerous Putin is, and she was being a useful idiot for the Russians, and she helped elect Donald Trump by cutting into Hillary Clinton's vote. And I tried to point out that, we've never had in geopolitics before the combination of national security and organized crime, nuclear weapons, and the mafia. And that's what we've had with Putin. And now the crime boss looks like he's losing his marbles.
To me, it's very important that we not spend too much time wondering let's see how it plays out in the next month. Is he really going crazy? I think this assumption that the world of political science often has, that all things being equal, people will act rationally. I think that all things are never equal, and people act irrationally all the time. I mean, this is, I think, part of the disciplinary divide between political science and history. If you look at empirical cases, people act irrationally really, really a lot of the time. I don't think we can assume that Putin is somebody who can be negotiated with. There is no reason for this war to be happening. Nothing he has said makes any sense, whatsoever. Oh, we have, native Russian speakers being held hostage by Ukrainian Nazis. I mean, Ukrainian Nazis who happen to have a Russian-speaking Jewish president. It obviously makes no sense whatsoever. And these are Ukrainian brothers. Therefore, we're going to come in and bomb their country and raze it to the ground. Why? What is the logical reason for that?
Well, they bombed the memorial to the Holocaust in Kyiv, next to the radio tower. I
mean, I can say something else perhaps in defense of my, Putin is deranged thesis that I admittedly based on, not on a scientific psychiatric examination, but on intuition. There was an interview Thursday morning on Echo Moskvi with Gleb Pavlovsky. And your listeners might not be familiar with Gleb Pavlovsky. He doesn't have as much of a profile in the English-speaking world because he doesn't speak English. But he was one of the political technologists, postmodern spin doctors who helped bring Putin to power. He subsequently became very remorseful, fell out with Putin at least a dozen years ago, and has changed sides, and everyone can have their own opinion about that. But he's somebody who knows Putin extremely well. And he gave an interview on Echo Moskvy, this vaguely independent Russian news station, hours after the invasion of Ukraine began, and he said, don't assume rationality. There is no rationality in this. None. There's not logic. There's not rationality. We can't be thinking that way.
Well, you point out that on February the 24th, the Russian writer Viktor Shenderovich gave an interview to the Russian news channel Echo Moskvy. This is a war by one person, he said, and then the phone line was cut off. Well, subsequent to that, of course, Echo Moskvy has been taken off the air altogether.
This is obviously not in the interest of Russia or Russians in any rational way you can understand. People are sending their kids, their sons, into Ukraine to kill other people and quite possibly to get killed themselves. And for what?
Well, Putin is becoming more and more isolated, and Biden in the State of the Union last night made it clear that efforts are underway to cause pain to the Siloviki, to the oligarchs that he regulates. Do you think that in the combination with the more sensible people in the security services and in the military, and how do you think that kind of pressure, in other words, is there a way to do a kind of group intervention by putting pressure on Putin's inner circle and oligarchs, etc.? In other words, can they do an intervention before something really terrible happens? I mean, we were really concerned about Donald Trump, again, another mentally unstable world leader who mercifully is no longer president, but is planning on making a comeback. There was a great deal of concern towards the end of his tenure that he may use a nuclear weapon. And again, there were some adults in the room prepared to do an intervention, like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Is there any such hope that might happen on the Russian side?
I am desperately hopeful. I have no particular intelligence. I certainly think it's something that people in Washington and people in the European Union have been thinking about a lot. I'm hopeful to some extent that that ordinary Russian people will step up. There's a petition that began almost immediately by the human rights activist Lev Ponomaryov, called, stop Niet Voyna, which is, say no to war, on change.org, directed towards Russian citizens. The language is very strong. One of the things that it says is that, when the Reichstag fire happened, it took some time for it to be exposed. Now we don't need to expose anything. Everything is already out there. We can see everything that's happening. That's no longer the issue. Now we need to make a moral stance. And as of this moment, 1,152,928 people have signed that petition. That's a lot, for Russians when you're taking a risk. They need more people on the streets. They're getting people on the streets. They arrested people the first day, but not enough. Obviously, if 100 people come out, they can arrest all 100. 1,000 come out, they can arrest all 1,000. They need 1 million, 2 million, 5 million people on the streets. Well, the Russians have to bring this man down.
Well, look at what he's doing. I mean, but unfortunately, the Russian people aren't seeing that. So are there things that the United States government could be doing through soft power, through, just compiling the footage of what's really happening in Ukraine and somehow getting it to the Russian people who are getting this ridiculously sanitized version that Russia is liberating Ukraine from a bunch of Nazis?
That I am desperately hopeful about that. I mean, I know a lot of my Russian friends are somewhat skeptical. My Russian friends are obviously not a representative sample, just like I I have a lot of friends in America. I mean, I feel very fortunate for that, but I didn't really know any Trump supporters. It was another world. And so I have a lot of Russian friends, but I don't actually know personally any Putin supporters. Everyone I know is on the other side. But some friends of mine have begun, and it just came out today, a new campaign, which is Skip Putin, Talk to Russians. It was published in Eurozine. You can look it up in English and in 7 or 8 other languages, and it's a desperate campaign to say, don't stop talking to your Russian friends. Talk to everybody. Keep talking. Keep going. Don't stop, send them real information. If you can't get it through in an ordinary way, get it through in another way. Look for the person who cut your hair when you were somewhere on vacation. Look for a business contact. Look for an academic contact. Use all connections. Skip Putin, Talk to Russians. Email them, message them, text them. Try to get through to them. It may be idealistic. I mean, I understand why there are many people who have kind of given up on them, but I don't believe it's a whole country of sadists. I mean, I don't believe it's a whole country of 144 million people who want nothing more than to bomb, rape, and pillage, Ukrainians. I'm willing to believe that you get some percentage, of sadists and psychopaths in every society, but I don't think it's enough, and I don't think it's 200,000 worse. I think there's a hope that some of those soldiers who were sent in, who don't really understand what they're doing there, will defect.
Well, I believe there's some evidence that that's already happening, that some of them already sabotaged the gas tanks on their tanks so they run out of diesel. There have been a number of surrenders, etc. That is certainly the hope. But, their Russian forces are seen to be making advances in the south. They seem to be stalled in the north. And, of course, Lukashenko, the gangster next door in Belarus, he'll probably be sending his troops in soon as well. It is a very, very grim military situation that the Ukrainians are following. So again, the hope is that it's all going to unravel from the Russian side. And as we are discussing, there are glimmers of that possibility. But when you look at history, of course, I mean, Hitler was obviously mentally unstable, particularly towards the end. That was mentioned, by the way, by Ukraine's ambassador to the UN before the United Nations, who, by the way, the General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to condemn Russia. But he mentioned, the Ukrainian representative to the UN mentioned Hitler being in his bunker, and maybe we can hope that Putin takes the same path that Hitler took at the end.
Yes, hopefully much faster.
Right.
Immediately. The speech that Zelensky gave, and I don't even know if speech is the right word for it, last Wednesday night, he made an address, perhaps 10, 15 minutes long, not very long, not to Putin, but directly to Russian citizens. He made it in Russian, which is his native language as well. I was an agnostic about Zelensky before that. I had not followed the politics of Ukraine that carefully, leading up to this, certainly not at that level. I hadn't followed his presidency carefully enough to have very strong opinions about just, how good or not good a job he was doing. But that was a remarkable address. I mean, listening to that and how he spoke to those people, it was very real. It was not political. It was not cowardly, and it was not cavalier, and it was not threatening. It was extremely human. He was saying, please listen. Do you really want to come fight us? Do you really want to come kill us? Because we don't want to fight you, and we don't want to kill you. If you come here and attack us, we will defend ourselves. You will not see our backs. We will not run away. You will see our faces. We will look you in the eye. But this is not what we want. Please don't do this. And it was remarkable. It was actually quite extraordinary.
In closing, Marci, there is a sort of geopolitical theory called the Samson theory, where the leader takes the temple down with him, And, well, do you agree with me that maybe this is time for Biden to talk about the Samson scenario? And, they did a very good job of publishing U.S. intelligence saying what Putin was going to do, and they were absolutely accurate. But maybe it's time for them to start talking about the fact that this guy's capable of taking down the whole world, as you've pointed out, and put everybody on warning, and maybe encourage those people inside the military and intelligence services and amongst the oligarchs in Russia to recognize that this madman is about to pull down the whole temple.
I would definitely vote for that. I don't think there's any reason to keep that hidden. And I certainly don't think I'm the only one who has intuited this, has noticed this. I don't think Fiona Hill is the only person who has. I mean, I think sometimes things are so horrific and so inconceivable that, we have a kind of defense mechanism against taking them in fast enough. But nothing is being hidden. I mean, this is in some sense really the difference between the 1930s and the present moment. I'm a historian. I work on the 1930s. I see lots of parallels. One thing that's very different about the present moment is that everything is right out there. In Slavic languages, there's a phrase, obnaženie, the laying bare. Everything is right out there. There's no secret. We can see everything that's happening.
Well, Marci Shore, I thank you so much for joining us here today. I think it's very important what you're pointing out, and I hope that the message gets out there that maybe we are dealing with a mentally unstable man with, 5,000 nukes at his fingertip.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I am going to remain desperately hopeful.
Well, I'll join you in that. And I've been speaking with Marci Shore, professor of history at Yale University, who teaches the intellectual history of 20th and 21st century Central and Eastern Europe. She is the author of The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. And her forthcoming book is Eyeglasses Floating in Space, Central European Encounters that Came About While